Last week, I sat through Ridley Scott's Napoleon with a friend who is, to put it mildly, a bit of a history buff. As the credits rolled, he wasn't just disappointed, he was visibly shaking with indignation. He butchered him, he kept muttering, as if the director had personally insulted a close relative. To my friend, Napoleon wasn't just a historical figure. He was an untouchable icon of French glory, a demigod of the battlefield who could do no wrong. But here's the funny thing about icons. When I asked my friend why he felt such a visceral connection to a man who lived 2 centuries ago, he didn't talk about the Napoleonic Code or civil administration. He talked about strength, standing up to the world, and defending the soul of the nation. He saw a hero who rose from the ashes of the revolution to save France from its enemies. Then I mentioned the tiny awkward detail. Did you know this greatest Frenchman actually spent his youth hating France and fighting for his home island to break away from it? The man who eventually crowned himself emperor started his career as a separatist rebel trying to tear the country apart. My friend's face went blank for a second, then he immediately pivoted. While the times changed him, he had to be strong because everyone was against them. That's when it hit me. We love to talk about great men and their destiny, but Napoleon's rise wasn't just about his military genius. It was about a very specific, very dangerous kind of magic. The ability to turn a nation's fear of outsiders into a blank check for absolute power. He didn't just lead France, he hacked the French psyche. He was the original wolf warrior, realizing that the more enemies you have at the gates, the more the people will let you do whatever you want inside the palace. So, was Napoleon the savior of the revolution, or just a brilliant opportunist who knew how to use nationalism as a drug? To understand the man, we have to look past the epic movie posters and understand why, sometimes, a nation is willing to trade its hard-won freedom for the shadow of a crown.
It is a striking contradiction, isn't it? Yeah. That gap between the myth and the reality.
It's huge. The wolf warrior on the movie poster, pointing his sword at the enemy.
Exactly. But the actual business of running an empire.
Yeah.
It's not glamorous at all. It's boring. It's spreadsheets and logistics.
It's mostly spreadsheets. And that's exactly what I want to get into with this deep dive today. I want to kind of push past the cavalry charges at Austerlitz for a bit.
Look under the hood.
Yeah, look into the engine room. Because when you start digging into the sources we've been looking at, the letters, the administrative records, the supply logs, they tell a completely different story. It's so much less cinematic, but to be honest, it's far more impressive.
Right. Charisma gets you in the door, but it doesn't keep an empire running for over a decade.
No. What kept him in power was a mastery of administration, of logistics, and I think a really deep understanding of political psychology.
That's the perfect way to put it. You have to strip away all the gold braid and the epic paintings. When you do that, what you find is a very specific and very modern system of control.
So how should we approach this? To really understand him, where do we start?
I think we need to break it down. If we want to understand his rise, how he managed to hold on to power for so long, and then why it all collapsed so spectacularly, we have to look at it through 3 specific lenses.
Okay, a framework.
It helps organize the chaos of it all. So first, we have what we're calling the blueprint. This is the story of how he built the modern state. How this young Corsican separatist basically created the bureaucratic machine that could actually function without a king.
The nuts and bolts.
The nuts and bolts. Then second, we have the battery. This is the power source, the economics and the logistics. It's a deep dive into why military genius means nothing when you run out of food and money. And we're going to focus really hard on the 1812 disaster in Russia for that.
The limits of power.
Exactly. And third, and this might be the most interesting one, is the bargain.
The bargain.
It's the psychological contract. Why on earth does a population that literally just beheaded its king to gain freedom then turn around and welcome an emperor with open arms? What was that deal?
Classic trade-off. Chaos versus order.
So blueprint, battery, and bargain.
I love it. Okay, let's start with the blueprint. Because, like you said, when you think of Napoleon, you don't think of, filing cabinets and civil service.
No, you think of cannons and eagles.
Right. But if you look at his actual legacy, the filing cabinets might be the most important thing he ever built. To really get a feel for this, I want to start with a story. It's a kind of narrative we've constructed from letters and accounts of the time to see it from the ground up.
Let's do it.
I've often heard that history is written by the victors, but the true pulse of an era is felt by those living in the shadows of great men. Imagine a young man named Julien living in a dusty provincial town in southern France around 1804. Before the Code of Napoleon, Julien's life was a dead end. His father was a peasant, and in the old world, Julien would have died a peasant. But I've read accounts of how the air changed during those years. Julian sits at a wooden desk, his fingers stained with ink, not dirt. He is a junior clerk in the new centralized administration, a position earned not by a noble surname, but by his ability to read, write, and organize. For the first time, the law is a printed book on his shelf, not a whim in a lord's head. He feels a strange new dignity, the sense that the state is a machine and he is a necessary gear. Reading about Julian makes me reflect on how we often view centralization as a cold bureaucratic term. But as a creator who looks at how societies function, I see the human relief in it. For Julian, that efficiency was his only ladder to social mobility. While we may rightfully criticize the loss of local autonomy, there is a profound, almost modern hope in the idea that a meritocratic blueprint could replace the chaos of birthright. It reminds me that in a world undergoing a civilizational shift, people will often embrace a rigid system if it promises that their hard work will finally be protected by a uniform law.
Julian is the perfect way to understand this. He is the protagonist of this entire section because he represents a new kind of person, a new class that frankly just didn't exist as a political or social force before Napoleon.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we use this word centralization, and it sounds so dull, right? It sounds like government paperwork. But for a person like Julian, centralization was freedom.
Freedom from what?
Freedom from the local lord. Freedom from the whim of the village priest or the bishop. Freedom from arbitrary power. The central state, this machine, was the only thing powerful enough to protect him from that.
Okay, so to really get why Julian feels this sense of relief, we have to understand what it was like before. The sources call pre-Napoleonic France the old mess, or a patchwork. What does that actually mean for a regular person just trying to live their life?
It means that your life was governed by chaos. Imagine this. You're traveling from, say, Paris in the north down to Marseille in the south. You're not just crossing geography, you're crossing, like, different legal universes.
So the laws literally changed as you walked down the road.
Drastically. Under the old system, the ancient regime, France was split into two main legal zones. Up north, they had what was called droit coutumier.
Customary law.
Right, customary law. It was unwritten, it was based on old Germanic and Frankish traditions, and it could be different from one village to the next. What was legal in one town might get you thrown in jail just 10 miles away.
That's insane.
But then you cross a sort of invisible line into the south of France, and suddenly you're in the land of droit écrit written law.
Based on Roman law.
Exactly, the old Roman codes. And there, the entire structure of society was different. For instance, in the South, the father had absolute authority over the family, the paterfamilias. So imagine a woman from the North where she might have some rights to her own property or her dowry. She marries a man from the South and moves there.
Her rights are just gone.
They could just evaporate because now she's living under a completely different legal system.
I can't even imagine trying to run a business in that environment. How would you sign a contract? Who would enforce it?
That's the point. You mostly didn't. Or you did it with enormous risk and expense. And that's not even counting all the other layers. The Catholic Church had its own laws and its own courts. The nobility had their own privileges and exemptions from taxes and laws. The king could issue a royal decree that overruled everything. There was no such thing as France from a legal perspective. One estimate I read said there were about 300 different legal codes all operating at the same time.
300! It's a miracle the country held together at all.
Barely. And that's what the revolution was supposed to fix, right? Liberty, equality, fraternity. They declared everyone equal.
But declaring it and actually making it happen are two different things.
Totally different. The revolutionaries were, a little busy. They were fighting off a coalition of European armies and guillotining each other.
Right. The terror.
Yeah. So they wrote drafts of legal codes, but then the government would fall or the guy who wrote the draft would lose his head. So you had this beautiful idea of a single unified law for all of France, but you didn't have an actual book you could hold in your hand and say, this is the law.
So enter Napoleon. He seizes power in the coup of 1799, and he seems to realize almost immediately that winning battles isn't enough. He has to actually write the rule book for the country.
He was obsessed with it. He knew that military victory was temporary, but the law would be permanent. So he appoints his commission of 4 very experienced jurists. The key figure here is a man named Jean-Étienne Marie Portelis.
And Portelis wasn't one of the wild-eyed revolutionaries.
No, and that's critical. He was a pragmatist, a moderate, and Napoleon basically locked them in a room and said, I don't care about your regional traditions. Unify the northern law and the southern law into one single code and do it fast.
And Napoleon wasn't just delegating this. The records are pretty clear that he was in the room for these meetings.
He was in the room constantly. He personally chaired more than half of the 100-plus sessions of the Council of State that debated the code. We have the transcripts. It's him, this 30-something artillery general, yelling at these old, dusty lawyers.
What was he yelling about?
Clarity. He hated jargon. He hated legal tradition for its own sake. He would keep interrupting them and asking things like, okay, but is this fair? Will a regular farmer understand what this means? Does this actually solve the problem, or is it just fancy words? He wanted a law that a citizen could read and understand.
Which is a revolutionary idea in itself.
It's a profoundly democratic idea, ironically, coming from a dictator.
So this process gives us the Civil Code of 1804, the Napoleonic Code. Let's really get into the mechanics of this blueprint. What did it actually do? What changed for Julian on that day in 1804?
You can break it down into three massive foundational pillars. First, and this sounds simple, but it's huge, the law must be written down and it must be published.
No more secret laws.
No secret laws. No unwritten traditions that a lord can just invent. If it's not in the book, it's not the law, period. That alone is a revolution in transparency.
Okay, pillar 1, transparency. What's 2?
Pillar 2 is the unification of property. Feudalism is officially, legally, dead and buried. All the weird, complex medieval land rights gone. No more feudal dues that a peasant has to pay a lord. No more situations where the lord owns the trees but the peasant owns the land under them. If you own the land, you own the land. Simple, clean.
And that must have just uncorked the economy.
It turns land from a medieval obligation into a modern, liquid asset. You can buy it, sell it, mortgage it. It's the foundation of a modern capitalist economy.
And the third pillar?
This is the one that changed Julian's life. Absolute equality before the law. The code does not care if you were a duke or a baker's son. You were treated the same in court. All the privileges, all the exemptions for the nobility and the clergy were wiped out with the stroke of a pen.
That's the promise of the revolution finally put on paper.
And this idea connects directly to another key part of the blueprint: meritocracy. The famous Napoleonic phrase, a career open to talents.
Right, the idea that any soldier carries a marshal's baton in his knapsack. How did he make that a reality?
Education. He took the system of elite schools, the grande école, which the revolution had started, and he supercharged them. Specifically schools like the École Polytechnique.
Great engineering school.
And here's the brilliant part, the real mechanism for social mobility he created. He changed the entrance requirements.
So,
under the old system, to be a high-ranking officer or a government official, what did you need to know? You needed to know Latin, Greek, rhetoric, the classics.
Things that only the sons of the wealthy, the nobility, would have tutors for.
Exactly. It was a cultural gate. Napoleon threw that out. He made the entrance exams for his elite schools all about mathematics, geometry, and physics. Math. Because math is the ultimate equalizer. It doesn't care who your father is. A duke's son can't inherit the ability to solve a quadratic equation. If you can't do the math, you can't design the cannon, you can't build a bridge, and you don't get in.
So a smart peasant boy like Julian, if he could find someone to teach him geometry,
he could pass that exam and suddenly become an artillery officer or a civil engineer for the state. And once you were in, the state paid for everything. This created an entire new generation of leaders, of technocrats, who were brilliant, who were skilled, and whose loyalty was not to some local duke. Their loyalty was to the state itself.
Because the state was what gave them their career, their dignity.
Their entire existence. It sounds incredibly modern, doesn't it? It's basically the idea of a meritocratic civil service that we take for granted today.
It does, but we have to be careful not to paint too rosy a picture here. This blueprint, this machine, it had some pretty serious design flaws. It was not a perfect meritocracy.
Oh, not even close.
Yeah.
You can't talk about Napoleon's meritocracy without immediately talking about his family.
Right. The Bonaparte clan. The ultimate Nepo babies.
It really complicates the whole career open to talents narrative when the biggest jobs in the empire go to your brothers and your cronies.
He made his brother Joseph the King of Spain.
And his brother Louis the King of Holland. His brother Jerome the King of Westphalia. His brother-in-law Murat, King of Naples.
So were any of them actually qualified for these jobs?
I mean, not really. By all accounts, Louis actually tried to be a good king for the Dutch, so much so that Napoleon got mad at him for being too Dutch and not French enough. But Joseph in Spain was a complete disaster. It shows that for all his talk of merit, Napoleon couldn't escape that old dynastic mindset. He wanted to be a new Charlemagne, a new Roman emperor, and that meant he needed vassal kings. and the only people he truly trusted were his own blood.
Which completely undermines the message he's selling back home to all the Julians.
It's a massive contradiction, and that's not even the worst of it. We've talked about what the code did for Julian. What did it do for Julian's sister?
Yeah, that's a huge blind spot.
It's a step backward, a huge step backward. The revolution, for all its chaos, had actually been quite progressive on women's rights. It legalized divorce by mutual consent. It gave women more control over property.
And Napoleon.
He rolls it all back. Aggressively. In his mind, the family was a microcosm of the state, a mini empire, and the husband was the emperor of the family.
So legally, what was a married woman's status?
She was a legal minor, same as a child.
Yeah.
She couldn't sell property without her husband's permission. She couldn't sign a contract. She couldn't even work in a profession without his written consent. There's a famous quote from him where he just says, "Women should stick to knitting."
He literally wrote patriarchy into the DNA of the modern French state. It was a modern system, but a fiercely patriarchal one.
And then there's the darkest shadow of all in this blueprint, the one that's hardest to reconcile with the son of the revolution image.
Larry.
He brought it back. He did. The French revolutionary government, the Convention, had abolished slavery in all French colonies in 1794. It was one of the great humanitarian achievements of the era, a beacon of liberty. Then, in 1802, Napoleon issued a decree that effectively reinstated it in the Caribbean colonies, especially Martinique and Guadeloupe.
Why? I mean, what was the reasoning? Was it pure racism or was it economic?
It was cold, brutal economic pragmatism. You looked at the balance sheets. The most valuable French colonies were the sugar islands, and sugar and coffee were the oil and gas of the 19th century economy.
So she needed the money.
He needed the money to fund his wars.
Yeah.
And he decided that the revenue from the slave plantations was more important than the revolutionary principle of human liberty. It was a spreadsheet decision. It led to a horrific war in Haiti, which he ultimately lost. But the moral stain is permanent. He treated the highest ideals of the revolution as just another variable to be manipulated for state power.
So the blueprint is this really complex legacy. On the one hand, it's efficient, it creates social mobility for men like Julian, it builds the modern state. On the other, it's repressive for women, nepotistic at the top, and barbaric in the colonies. But here's the incredible thing. It lasted.
That's the ultimate test of its power, isn't it? Napoleon falls in 1815. The old Bourbon kings come back. They despise Napoleon. They want to erase everything he did.
But they don't erase the code.
They keep the code. They keep the central bank. They keep the École Polytechnique. They keep the whole administrative system of prefects running the country. Why? Because you can't uninvent efficiency. The machine he built was just too good at collecting taxes, raising armies, and running a country. Even his greatest enemies had to admit that.
So it becomes the new operating system, not just for France, but for Europe.
Absolutely. As his armies marched across Europe, they brought the code with them. To Italy, to Germany, to Poland. And even after they were kicked out, the new rulers kept the system. It was the blueprint for the modern nation state.
So he builds this state-of-the-art machine, a Ferrari of state. But even a Ferrari needs fuel, a lot of high-octane fuel.
And a good engine.
Which brings us perfectly to our second lens, the battery. You can have the best bureaucracy in the world, the most rational legal code, but if you can't pay your bills and you can't get food to your army, that beautiful machine just grinds to a halt.
And this is where the popular image of Napoleon as a military genius starts to really fall apart. Because he was a genius on the battlefield, yes, but he was fighting a much bigger war against physics and economics, and he lost that war.
To really see this in action, we need to get out of the government offices in Paris and onto the front lines, and we're going to do that by looking at the disastrous Russian campaign of 1812, but not through Napoleon's eyes. We're going to see it through the eyes of a supply officer.
The guy counting this.
Exactly, the guy whose job it is to keep the battery charged. I was looking at some historical archives recently and came across the imagined perspective of a supply officer named Mark, shivering in the outskirts of a burning Moscow in 1812. Try to imagine the silence of the snow, broken only by the sound of boots falling apart. Mark isn't thinking about Napoleon's genius or the glory of the empire. He is staring at a broken wagon. He remembers the bustling ports of London he heard about, the endless flow of grain, cloth, and iron moving across the seas, backed by an invisible, humming industrial engine. Mark realizes that while his emperor can outmaneuver any general, he cannot outmaneuver the lack of a coat or a biscuit. The French hegemony was a lightning bolt, brilliant and terrifying, but it lacked the steady physical battery of Britain's maritime trade and industrial output. When I think about Mark's despair in that freezing wasteland, it hits home how fragile greatness is when it isn't anchored in economic reality. As someone who covers global shifts, I find this a sobering reminder. Military brilliance is a fleeting spark, but a sustainable industrial base is the hearth that keeps a nation alive. It's a harsh truth that might seem cold, but from a perspective of human survival, Mark's story shows that logistical failure is the ultimate check on human ambition. It makes me realize that true power isn't just about winning the battle, it's about having the strength to feed the army the morning after.
Can you feed the army the morning after? That is the fundamental question of warfare. And it's the one Napoleon failed in 1812. We have this popular image, this myth, that the Grande Armée was destroyed by General Winter.
Right, the endless snow, the freezing temperatures.
And that happened, of course. But if you actually dig into the data, the reports from supply officers like our imaginary Mark, you realize the army was already destroyed. The battery had failed long before the first snowflake fell.
Okay, let's get into that data because the numbers here are just mind-boggling. He invades Russia with the largest European army ever assembled at that point. What was it, something like 600,000 men?
It's hard to get an exact number, but it's somewhere between 500,000 and 650,000. It was a colossal force. And Napoleon wasn't stupid. He knew he couldn't live off the land in a poor, sparsely populated country like Russia the way he had in rich places like Italy or Germany.
So he knew he had to bring his own supplies.
Yes. He organized this massive logistical train, thousands and thousands of wagons pulled by horses, carrying everything from flour and wine to ammunition and horseshoes. But here's where you run into the fundamental, unsolvable math problem of pre-industrial warfare.
Which is?
The horses. A horse, especially one pulling a heavy wagon over bad roads, needs to eat about 20 pounds of fodder oats and hay every single day.
20 pounds per horse. Okay, so how many horses did he have?
When you add up the cavalry horses and all the horses pulling the wagons and the artillery, you're looking at a number somewhere around 200,000 to 250,000 horses.
Wait, so 250,000 horses times 20 pounds of food a day.
Do the math. You're talking about 5 million pounds of horse food.
Per day.
You can't carry that. It's impossible.
It's literally impossible. It's what military historians call the tyranny of the wagon equation. After a certain distance, the wagons are just carrying food for the horses that are pulling the wagons that are carrying the food for the horses.
It's a logistical death spiral. The system eats itself. It eats itself. You reach a point of diminishing returns very quickly. Napoleon's entire strategy was based on a gamble. He gambled that he could force the Russians into a decisive battle near the border and win the whole war in about 20 days.
Before his supplies ran out.
Exactly. But the Russians refused to play his game. They just kept retreating deeper and deeper into Russia. And as they retreated, they burned everything. They scorched the earth. And that's when the first catastrophe hit the horses. And it wasn't the cold.
I saw this in the source material. It was the summer that killed them.
It was the summer. June and July. The army is marching through Poland and western Russia. The supply wagons can't keep up on the terrible roads, so the horses have nothing to eat but the grass and rye growing in the fields. But it's early in the season, so the rye is unripe. It's green fodder.
And that's bad for horses.
It's deadly. When a horse gorges on huge amounts of this green fermenting grass, it produces massive amounts of gas in their digestive system. They get terrible colic. Their stomachs can literally rupture. Or they get severe diarrhea and just dehydrate and die in the summer heat.
So his horses are dying of stomach aches.
Tens of thousands of them. They were dropping like flies in June. And every time a supply horse dies, what happens?
You have to abandon a wagon.
You abandon a wagon, and what's in that wagon? It's the soldiers' biscuits, it's the spear boots, it's the medical supplies, it's the ammunition. So by the time the Grande Armée even reached the first major battle at Smolensk, it was already a starving, ragged army. The battery was half empty before they'd even seen Moscow.
And this wasn't just a problem with the animals. The human system he set up to manage the logistics also failed. I want to talk about this thing called the Bright Company.
Ah, yes. The great experiment in military outsourcing.
What was that?
Well, Napoleon didn't really have a fully professional militarized supply corps in the way a modern army does. So for the Russian campaign, he hired a huge private consortium, a German company called the Bright Company, to provide a lot of the wagons and, crucially, the drivers.
So he's using private contractors in the middle of a war zone. I feel like I know how this story ends.
It ends exactly how you'd expect. These drivers were civilians. They were getting paid a wage. They weren't ideologically committed soldiers. So when the supplies started to run low, when the roads turned to mud, and when the Russian Cossacks started raiding the supply columns, what did the drivers do?
They ran away.
They did the perfectly rational thing. They cut the horses free from the wagons, and they rode off to save themselves, leaving all those tons of crucial supplies just stuck in the mud for the Russians to capture.
So our supply officer, Mark, is standing there looking at a wagon that's full of flour, but he's got no horse to pull it and no driver to guide it.
The whole system was brittle. Napoleon eventually tried to fix it mid-campaign by militarizing the supply train and putting his own soldiers in charge, but it was far too little, far too late. The logistical backbone of the army had already been snapped.
And this failure in Russia, it wasn't a one-off. It was really just a symptom of a much deeper systemic problem with the entire Napoleonic enterprise. The battery comparison gets really clear when you zoom out and compare France to its main enemy, Britain.
This is the classic whale versus the elephant analogy. Britain, the great sea power, the whale. France, the great land power, the elephant.
But it's more than that. It's also, as the sources put it, the bank versus the looters.
That's a much better way to describe it. Britain was in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. They were building factories. They had a global trading empire powered by the Royal Navy. And this is the most important part. They had the Bank of England.
Why is having a credible national bank so important in a world war like this?
It's all about credit. War is phenomenally expensive. Britain paid for its war against Napoleon primarily by issuing government debt bonds called consols. And because the British government had a long, stable history of always paying its interest on time, people trusted it.
So they were seen as a safe investment.
The safest in the world. So wealthy individuals and banks all over Europe, even in enemy territory like France, would buy British government bonds. This gave the British government access to a virtually bottomless pit of money to build more ships, to equip its armies, and to pay subsidies to its allies, like Russia and Austria, to keep fighting Napoleon.
Okay, so that's Britain's battery. What about France's?
France's battery was broken. During the Revolution, the government had basically destroyed its credit rating. They had issued all this paper money, the échange, that became completely worthless through hyperinflation. So nobody, inside or outside of France, trusted the French state with their money. Napoleon couldn't borrow money on a large scale. He had to pay for everything in cash, in gold and silver.
So if you can't borrow money to fight a war, where do you get the cash?
You steal it. The entire Napoleonic war machine was funded by conquest. You invade a rich country like Italy, you march into Milan, you empty out their treasury, you take their priceless works of art, you ship all that gold and silver back to Paris, and you use it to pay for the next campaign.
It's basically a continent-sized Ponzi scheme.
It's a Ponzi scheme of war, and it works great as long as you keep winning and keep expanding into new, rich territories to loot.
But the second you stop, like when you get bogged down in a poor country like Spain, or you have a catastrophic failure like in Russia,
the cash flow stops. The whole system grinds to a halt. And at the same time, the domestic economy in France is collapsing, because you've taken all the young men off the farms and out of the workshops and drafted them into the army.
This all leads directly to his biggest economic gamble, the Continental System. This was his attempt to destroy the British battery, right?
It was his Hail Mary. He knew he couldn't invade Britain directly because the Royal Navy was just too powerful. So he decided if he couldn't beat them militarily, he would crush them economically. He would strangle them.
And how did he plan to do that?
In 1806, he issued the Berlin Decree. It was a simple, brutal command. No country on the continent of Europe, from Portugal to Russia, is allowed to trade with Great Britain. Any British ship, any ship carrying British goods was to be seized.
He wanted to shut down their factories, bankrupt them.
That was the theory. Britain was the workshop of the world. If they couldn't sell all the cloth and cutlery and tools they were making, their factories would close, unemployment would soar, there would be riots, and the British government would be forced to sue for peace. On paper, it's not a crazy idea.
But in reality...
In reality, it was an absolute disaster. For everyone except Britain, basically.
Why? Because people just wanted British stuff.
It wasn't just that they wanted it. Their economies depended on it. Europe relied on all sorts of colonial goods, sugar, coffee, tobacco, cotton, for their textile mills that were primarily transported on British ships. When Napoleon banned them, the prices for these goods went through the roof.
Which creates a massive black market.
The biggest black market the world had ever seen. Smuggling became the most profitable industry in Europe. Everyone did it. Even Napoleon's own top officials, his own marshals, were getting rich by secretly allowing British goods into their territories.
There's that amazing story about the army's overcoats.
It's the perfect illustration of the absurdity of it all. At one point, Napoleon's army needed 50,000 new greatcoats for a winter campaign in Poland. The French textile industry couldn't produce them fast enough. So what did his quartermasters do?
They bought them from Britain.
They secretly bought huge quantities of high-quality British wool cloth, smuggled it into Hamburg, had it dyed French blue, and made it into coats for the French army.
So Napoleon's soldiers were marching off to potentially fight the British while wearing British wool.
That is the spectacular irony of the continental system. It didn't destroy Britain. In fact, it forced Britain to find huge new markets for its goods in South America and Asia, which made them even richer in the long run. But it did destroy the economies of Napoleon's own allies.
Like Russia.
Russia was the key. The entire Russian economy depended on exporting raw materials, timber for ships' masts, hemp for ropes, to Great Britain. When Napoleon forced the Tsar to cut off that trade, the Russian landowning aristocracy was ruined. The state was going bankrupt. That is the real reason the Tsar eventually broke his alliance with Napoleon.
So the invasion of Russia in 1812, the great logistical failure, was actually caused by the failure of his economic policy. The battery failure led to the military failure.
The whole disastrous campaign was an attempt to enforce a flawed economic idea. Our poor supply officer, Mark, freezing to death in the snow outside Moscow, is the ultimate victim of an economic policy that simply ignored reality. Physical economic strength is the only foundation for lasting power. You can't just issue a decree and make it so.
Okay, so we have the blueprint, this hyper-efficient but flawed state machine, and we have the battery, this powerful but ultimately unsustainable economic engine based on plunder. But there's a third piece to this puzzle, the human element. Even after the catastrophe in Russia, even after he was defeated and exiled to the island of Elba in 1814, he came back.
The 100 Days.
And the people, the soldiers, flocked to his banner again. Why? After all that bloodshed, all that failure, why did they still choose him?
This, to me, is the most fascinating and the most relevant part of his story, the bargain. Why do people who have tasted freedom sometimes choose to trade it away for a strong man? It's not because they're stupid. It's often a very rational calculation based on deep collective trauma.
And to understand that trauma, we have to look at what France was like right before he took over. We need to go back to the streets of Paris and meet our final character.
The shopkeeper.
The shopkeeper. Let's set the scene. There's a story I encountered in a collection of letters from a Parisian shopkeeper named Elena, who lived through the transition from the bloody chaos of the 1790s to the stability of Napoleon's early reign. Imagine her standing in her doorway watching the streets. For years, she saw the procedural performance of the revolution show. Endless debates, shifting committees, and the constant, terrifying threat of the guillotine, all while her shelves remained empty and the streets were ruled by mobs. Then comes the imperial order. The noise of the debates is replaced by the rhythmic marching of guards and the steady reopening of markets. To Elena, the empty liberty of the chaos was a nightmare. The efficiency of the emperor, however undemocratic, meant she could open her shop without fear. I look at Elena's choice and I feel a complex mix of emotions. From our modern democratic perspective, we want to scream that liberty is worth the price. But as I report on crises around the world today, I have to be honest about the human heart. When people face an existential crisis, they will almost always choose a system that works over one that merely speaks. Elena's preference for institutional efficacy over failing performance is a recurring theme in history. While it's vital to gird our freedoms, we must also understand the deep collective survival instinct that drives people toward order when the alternative is a void. It's a reminder that for a government to be legitimate in the eyes of its people, it must, at the very least, be able to keep the lights on and the streets safe.
Keeping the lights on. It seems like such a low bar for a government, doesn't it? But in France, in the late 1790s, the government couldn't even manage that.
We need to talk about what Elena was escaping. The government that Napoleon overthrew was called the Directory. We don't learn much about it in school. It gets skipped over between Robespierre and Napoleon. But for people like Elena, this was their reality for years.
And it was a reality of total dysfunction. The Directory was run by a 5-man executive committee, and they were constantly squabbling, plotting against each other. The government was paralyzed. But for an ordinary person, the problem wasn't the political infighting. It was the complete collapse of daily life.
The economy.
The economy was in a death spiral. The hyperinflation from the revolutionary paper money had wiped out everyone's savings. Bread prices could double in a single day. People were literally starving in the streets of Paris, while a new class of corrupt war profiteers, the nouveau riches, were throwing these incredibly lavish parties. The inequality was staggering.
And it wasn't just poverty, it was the lack of safety. The banditry was out of control.
The state had completely lost its monopoly on violence. The sources talk about these gangs of bandits, called the chauffeurs.
Which means heaters.
Because their signature move was to break into a farmhouse and literally burn the feet of the residents over the fire until they told them where they had hidden their money. This was happening all over France. Traveling between towns was taking your life in your hands.
So this is the world Elena is living in. Constant fear, constant uncertainty. So when Napoleon comes along in 1799 and stages his coup, he's not promising them some grand new ideology. He's promising them something much more basic.
He essentially walks on stage and says, "The revolution is over. I am the revolution." What he meant was, the chaos is over. The debates are over. I am here to make things work. And he delivered. He sent out the army to crush the bandits on the roads. He created the Bank of France to stabilize the currency and end inflation.
So for Elena, the shopkeeper, the change was immediate and tangible.
Absolutely. The next day, she can walk to the market without fear of being mugged. She can sell a loaf of bread for a coin that she knows will be worth the same amount tomorrow. That is the bargain.
You trade your political liberty, your right to vote, which was a sham under the Directory anyway, and you trade your freedom of the press, and in return, you get a functioning society. You get your life back.
It's the bargain of efficiency. And Napoleon was an absolute master at selling this bargain. He was arguably the first truly modern media dictator. He understood the power of propaganda, of image.
The wolf warrior myth again.
But it was so carefully and brilliantly curated, he took complete control of the press. He famously said, "If I give the press freedom, I will not last 3 months in power." But it wasn't just censorship. He actively created his own narrative through art. The best example is that famous painting, Bonaparte, visiting the plague victims of Jaffa.
Right, the one from the Egyptian campaign. He's in a dark building, surrounded by his sick and dying soldiers.
Look at the composition of that painting. It's not an accident. It's deliberately posed to look like paintings of Christ healing the lepers. Napoleon is the central illuminated figure. He is reaching out and touching the open plague sore of a sick soldier with his bare hand. He looks serene, fearless, divine. Meanwhile, his officers behind him are cowering and covering their noses with handkerchiefs.
So what's the message he's sending to the French public who see this painting in a salon in Paris?
The message is threefold. 1, I am not like other men. I am not afraid of death. I am protected by destiny. 2, I care deeply about my ordinary soldiers. I will touch them in their suffering. And 3, I am a healer. I bring order and health out of chaos and sickness.
But the actual historical reality of what happened at Jaffa was significantly different.
To put it mildly, he did visit the plague hospital. That part is true. But a few days later, the army had to retreat, and they couldn't take the several dozen soldiers who were too sick to move. They would have been captured and tortured to death by the Ottomans. So Napoleon ordered the doctors to administer fatal doses of opium to them.
He euthanized his own men.
You could call it a mercy killing, and maybe it was the most humane option available. But it was a grim, pragmatic military decision. The painting takes that horrific reality and spins it into a Christ-like fable of divine compassion. It's propaganda of genius.
But so he gives them safety, he gives them a stable economy, and he gives them this myth of a savior. But there was one final, crucial piece of the bargain. He had to heal the spiritual wound of the revolution.
The Concordat. This, I think, was his single greatest act of political genius.
Explain what that was.
The revolution had declared total war on the Catholic Church. They saw it as an ally of the monarchy and superstition. They seized all the church's land. They killed priests and nuns. They created this bizarre new state religion called the Cult of Reason and put a statue of a goddess in Notre Dame Cathedral. They even abolished the 7-day week and created a 10-day week, partly to make people forget which day was Sunday.
And how did the French people, who were overwhelmingly Catholic, feel about this?
They absolutely hated it, especially in the countryside. Our shopkeeper, Elena, she wants to have her children baptized. She wants to get married in a church. She wants to hear the church bells ring on a Sunday. This was a deep tear in the fabric of French society. Napoleon, who was basically an agnostic or a deist himself, couldn't have cared less about theology. But he saw this division and understood it was a source of weakness for the state.
He famously said religion is the mystery of the social order.
Exactly. He saw it as social glue, a tool for control. So in 1801, he cut a deal with the Pope. He was called the Concordat.
And what did the deal say?
It was essentially a hostile takeover of the French church. He said, okay, Catholicism is the religion of the great majority of Frenchmen. The churches can reopen. But the state would now appoint the bishops and pay the salaries of all the priests.
So the priests basically became civil servants.
They became spiritual prefects. They had to swear an oath of loyalty to the government, and they were required to read government decrees from the pulpit during Sunday Mass. He brought the church back, but he brought it back on his terms, as an arm of the state.
But for the average person in the pews, for Elena.
For Elena, it meant Sunday was back, the church bells were ringing again, the great wound of the revolution was healed, and that bought him a bottomless well of loyalty and gratitude from millions of ordinary French people.
So that's the complete bargain. He gives the people bread economic stability. He gives them safety, law, and order. And he gives them God the Concordat. And in return, they give him two things.
Their political silence and their sons for his army.
And that bargain held. For more than a decade it held, until the price just became too high.
It held until the battery ran completely dry. When the wars stopped being profitable, when the looting stopped, when hundreds of thousands of their sons didn't come back from the snows of Russia, the bargain finally broke. The French people decided the price of order was too high.
It's an incredible story. When you put all three pieces together, the blueprint, the battery, and the bargain, you see this tragic, epic arc. He builds this incredible state machine to save France from chaos, but then he overloads the battery with his own relentless ambition. And in the end, the bargain he made with the people can't possibly survive the cost of that ambition.
But the incredible thing is what remains. The battery failed. The bargain broke. The wolf warrior died alone in exile in St. Helena. But the blueprint is still here. We are all, in some way, living in the world that the Napoleonic Code built. That vision of a centralized meritocratic state with a single rational law for all citizens. That's his permanent legacy. The administrator outlives the emperor.
It really brings us right back to where we started, back to my friend in the movie theater. We go to see the movie for the epic battles for the wolf warrior. But the real story, the one that actually changed the world, is the story of the systems, the structures.
We go for the action, but we should stay for the administration. It's not as catchy, I know.
It's not. But I think that's the big takeaway from this deep dive. History isn't just about the will of great men. It's about the systems they build, the economic realities they ignore, and the deep psychological bargains they strike with a population's fear of chaos.
And that's a story that never gets old.
So the next time you see one of those statues, a general on a horse looking heroic, it's worth taking a moment to ask some different questions. Who fed that horse? Who wrote the laws for the people on the ground? And what exactly was the price of the peace they promised? It turns out, looking past the movie poster doesn't make the story less interesting, it makes it real. And usually the reality is far more instructive than the myth.